How does Bibi do it? Israel's longest-serving prime minister leading the vote tally yet again, this time, even though Benjamin Netanyahu's 2 weeks away from the start of his corruption trial. We'll pore over the results, ask our panel whether his victory claim is perhaps premature, and see what he got right in the country's third snap poll in under a year. Unprecedented, a year without a government, which makes one wonder what Israel's got wrong with its democracy. We'll also ask about the losers on the night and why the traditional left has all but disappeared in a nation ruled at its inception by secular socialists. Part of the answer this time around is the rallying of the peace camp to the joint list that brings together left-wing Jews and Israeli Arabs. What are the new fault lines of Israeli politics? With the economy strong and Donald Trump's support for what Palestinians have branded a land grab in the West Bank, is the long reign of Benjamin Netanyahu just beginning? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if it's close enough this time for Bibi. With us, attorney Ron Sofert, who's just back from Tel Aviv.
Yes.
Where you voted?
Yes.
Where you voted, all right. And you voted for?
I voted for Mr. Netanyahu.
Okay. Also with us, put you on the spot there. Also with us, Nimrod Flashenberg, campaign manager for the Joint List. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
We're also joined from Jerusalem by Daniel Sturman,
by the way, I'm the Hebrew
Israeli
campaign manager.
elections blogger with the Times of Israel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And France 24 correspondent Iris Mockler is also in Jerusalem. Hello, Iris.
Hello, hello.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, earlier it was 97% of ballots counted, and the provisional tally gives the right religious bloc 59 seats to 39 to former Army Chief of Staff Benny Gantz's blue and white coalition, 15 for the joint list that we mentioned, and perhaps as kingmaker, Yisrael Beitenu of the former Foreign and Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman. For most Israelis, 2 seats shy, well, that's close enough to pick up a couple more lawmakers and break the impasse. Although, as we've seen in the past, anything's possible. Charlie James has more.
It's still unclear whether Benjamin Netanyahu will amass the 61 parliamentary seats needed to continue his premiership. But Likud party supporters in Tel Aviv are already celebrating.
Unbelievable. We couldn't expect better. We are so happy.
Exit polls indicate the Israeli prime minister holds a solid edge over his main rival in the country's third election in under a year. In Jerusalem, his supporters are enthusiastic the country's political deadlock could be over.
We are very happy this morning to wake up to a result that says that Benjamin Netanyahu can form the next government. We wish him the best of luck, and we hope that he will keep all of his promises.
For rival Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party, this election marks a devastating setback. It had hoped to end Netanyahu's over a decade in power. Gantz supporters expressed dismay that so many voters continue to trust Netanyahu.
I'm very disappointed. In fact, I'm pretty surprised that half of the country is interested in somebody who has criminal charges against him being the prime minister of the country. Israel has been through difficult times, and I hope it'll get through this difficult time, too.
It's all celebrations for members of the joint list of Arab parties. The alliance is predicted to take 15 seats, its highest number ever, and plans to wield its power.
We will block Netanyahu from forming a government.
Netanyahu has vowed to immediately begin forming a new coalition, a feat he has already failed at twice.
Lots to mull over there. Let's begin with you, Iris Mockler. Any further news as that vote tally finishes its end, nears its end?
Yes, there is news. It's now 58-54 if you're going to look at it that way. So the right-wing Benjamin Netanyahu losing one seat at this moment and the opposition bloc gaining one seat. So although this has been a huge victory for Benjamin Netanyahu personally, I don't know that it's a huge victory for him politically.
Well, he just needs to pick off 3 members of the Knesset. That's doable, isn't it, Iris?
Well, it wasn't doable before when we cast our minds back through all these ripples of elections back to April. It wasn't doable then. He was on 60, couldn't form the coalition and thought it was worthwhile going to a second election. So I don't know if it's doable. Perhaps a unity government would actually be more doable if there was some kind of change in the perspectives of both sides. I honestly don't know what to say to you, but I do know that it is a very familiar deadlock to Israeli voters and one that is quite frightening to them too.
Ron Sofer, is it enough to form a coalition at this point?
Well, I agree. It's very difficult to know. I mean, he would need 3 people to defect. I don't know whether he has the votes to do it, whether he will be able to negotiate it. I think that the difference between the what happened the first elections and this time is that people are tired of having elections. And I think the fact that the Likud got so many seats more than the Blue and White Party gives the Netanyahu the legitimacy this
That's
time.
the game changer.
That's the game changer, and I think he might just be able to pull through and get those 3 necessary votes.
Is that the scenario that you personally prefer, or would you like to see a unity government?
I'm not sure whether a unity government would work, but I think that once a government is formed, what I would like to see is that the government is formed. What may happen is that Netanyahu forms a government with 61 votes, and then other parties will join eventually, maybe not immediately, and then we'll see what happens.
All right, Nimrod Flaschenberg, we saw in that report at the outset, the leader of your bloc stating that he was confident that he'd be able to block Bibi from forming a government. Why is that?
Well, we believe that the fact that Netanyahu went below 60%, like what happened in this election is that the right-wing Likud party rose, and that the joint list representing the Palestinian minority in Israel and the democratic forces rose. And if it was only Netanyahu, then he would have gotten a majority of 61, 62, 63. But because we went out in droves to the ballot stations and increased significantly the turnout among Palestinian minority in Israel, and also had a first-time actual flood of voters to the joint list from the Jewish left, then we saw that we were able to diminish his bloc to under 60. And actually, there was just an update that increased our votes to 16 seats, and that seat was taken out of the Likud party itself. I don't know if it will stay that way. It could swing because there are other absentee ballots and so on. But we were able to block the extreme right government, hopefully, that will not be able to, that Netanyahu will not be able to form.
So hold on, if I understand you correctly, you're making the argument for a 4th snap general election?
I'm not making an argument for a general election. I think that Netanyahu's advantage is significant. I don't see... There are many ways in which this deadlock could resolve itself. What is certain is that we will be the strongest opposition to whichever right-wing government will be formed. Whether it's only Netanyahu or Netanyahu and Gantz together, the realization right now is that the only remaining strong ideological and forceful left in Israel is the joint list. that is based on the leadership of the Palestinian minority in Israel, but also has place for people, for Jewish Israelis who believe in democracy.
All right, for the third time in a year, we saw an election night in Israel, and we saw Benjamin Netanyahu speak to supporters after those initial exit polls, and each time billing this as the political fight of his life.
It's a win against all odds because we stood up against powerful forces. They already eulogized us. Our enemies said the Netanyahu era is over. But we turned the plate on its head. We turned the lemons to lemonade.
So Daniel Sturman, did he turn lemons into lemonade?
I guess he might have turned one lemon into a lemonade. He definitely increased his vote share from the previous election in September. He has managed to depress the vote share of his main rival, Blue and White. But he doesn't have enough for a coalition. He doesn't have a 61-seat majority. It's going to be very difficult for him to do this. Back in April, the first of the three elections that we had in April 2019, he was 2 seats away from completing a coalition, and now he's 3, and it's going to be a lot more difficult. He has to find some deal off of either there are rumors of certain members of Knesset. Sorry, there are rumors of certain members of Knesset in Blue and White who he might be able to convince to join his side, the Gesher party, but it remains to be seen whether he'll be able to succeed in any of that.
Did you take Ron Sofer's point that it's not so much how Netanyahu fared, but the fact that the Blue and White coalition skidded this time and did worse than the previous vote, that forces them to defer to Netanyahu?
I doubt it. The Blue and White Party is the entire Israeli coalition, the entire Israeli political system is very polarized. And with Netanyahu's trial beginning in just a few weeks, there's not very much incentive for them to help him out, especially if they believe that in a fourth election, he's going to be in the middle of the trial. He might already be certain that will cause his pain a lot of trouble.
All right, apologies. We seem to have technical issues with the Skype. We'll try to correct those. Ron Sofer.
I disagree because they've already tried this. Because in the first election there was a proposed indictment, and then there was an indictment, and the press has commented the indictment fully and advocated it. And despite that, the people said that they're not convinced.
What are the optics going to be when the actual trial begins, though?
But because the problem with this indictment is that we're talking about corruption, but it's not corruption with cash. It's corruption. It's supposedly corruption with favorable press coverage. And the people just, if he had been accused of receiving a suitcase full of cash, he wouldn't have gotten one vote. But because of this very unprecedented indictment, in terms of enlarging the scope of the bribery charge and to include favorable press coverage, the people were just not persuaded. And I don't think that if there is a trial, and even if there are elections during the trial, I don't think it's going to change anything, because first of all, the trial he's going to show up in 2 weeks. He's going to plead not guilty. And then let's not forget that the indictment includes 300 prosecution witnesses. It's going to take years. So he's going to plead not guilty, and then the witnesses are going to be heard one by one. His lawyers are going to cross-examine them. He doesn't have to be there. He probably will not have to spend a lot of time in this trial, handling this trial. And I don't think that this whole corruption, indictment, trial has worked against him. And I'm not sure it will work against him in the future if there is another round of election.
Daniel Sturman, what does your analysis say when you look at the polling? Is that true? It hasn't dented Netanyahu's popularity?
Ron is definitely correct. It has not dented Netanyahu's popularity. The right wing has very much solidified around him. But Ron's argument is not an argument for saying that the blue and white campaign will succeed. It's only an argument for saying that blue and white, he's saying that blue and white is not going to succeed in hurting Netanyahu's image, which might well be true. But if blue and white thinks that they can take advantage of the trial, regardless of whether or not they turn out to be correct, that is an incentive for them not to help pull Netanyahu out of it at this point. That is an incentive for them to help bring Israel to a fourth election that they think will bring them to a greater advantage. Ron could be right. The blue and white plan to do this, if that is in fact their plan, will be completely unsuccessful if Ron is correct. That doesn't mean that they don't think otherwise.
But there's one wild card that people have to take into account, and that's the Trump peace plan. And that's probably the reason why the Arab Party has done so well, because most of the Jewish Zionist parties would probably support Trump's peace plan, and the only party that is against
except those who favor a two-state solution.
Well, even those, I mean, the plan Trump has enough in it to be perceived as favorable even by those who believe in the two-state solution, and therefore the Arab parties took all the voters that are against the Trump plan. I think that the reason why Netanyahu has done well is because he wants to implement it, and I think that speaks to many Israelis.
Iris Makler, what was the issue on the campaign trail?
I would say two things. One is the stellar campaigning of Benjamin Netanyahu. He showed himself to be energetic, determined, great work, community by community, a lot of mudslinging. It was a dirty campaign. I would say an ugly campaign. Some say the ugliest in Israeli history.
Yeah, we had Iris on that point.
Netanyahu.
We had the final days of the campaign, including that advisor secretly recorded by a rabbi as he told him that Benny Gantz wasn't up to the job, and then Israel's Channel 12 uncovering how said rabbi met with the prime minister before the tape had been leaked to the press. Was that a big factor?
I'm not saying it was a big factor in. Let me rephrase that. I think it was effective. So that even though on the morning of the election we learned that Netanyahu's denial that he had had anything to do with it was not correct, because there was the tape showing that he had had something to do with it, which he denied on camera the night before. That was all too little too late, and I think the drip, drip, drip of mudslinging against Benny Gantz was effective. I do think that. That was one thing. I also think that Benny Gantz himself didn't run a great campaign. Blue and white didn't run a great campaign, particularly with regard to the Arab vote. They lost, I would say, 2 seats at least. They're at 32 at the moment. They would be 34. Netanyahu is now back to 35. They would be very, very close. But they lost 2 seats because they said, we will not sit with the Arab parties in the government. They didn't have to do that. They were chasing a soft right vote. They thought that it would mean that Netanyahu couldn't attack them, but the right-wing parties attacked them anyhow. It didn't convince the public, and it did alienate the Arab voters. So I think they didn't run a very good campaign. Those were 2 things that struck me.
All right. It's very interesting that everyone's mentioning the joint list and how it may be about the Trump peace plan, as Ron Sofer says, but it could also be a more broader shift in Israeli politics. We'll talk about it when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're still crunching the numbers as they're still tallying the ballots from Israel's unprecedented third snap general election in under a year. And it seems to be following a script, with Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest ever serving prime minister, first declaring victory, and then, as we wait for the final tally, it becomes sometimes a little more uncertain at this point. We're joined by attorney Ron Sofer, just back from casting his ballot in Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv itself, we have Nimrod Flashenberg, campaign manager for the Joint List, which brings together Arabs and left-wing Israelis. We're also joined by Daniel Sturman, an Israeli election blogger for the Times of Israel, and France 24's very own correspondent Iris Makler is in Jerusalem. We were talking about the Joint List back in September. It won a record 13 seats. This time, it's sure to be even more.
We have made a parliamentary achievement that has not been seen in the history of the Knesset. It is a historical achievement. Our people acted in an aware, patriotic, courageous manner that has never been seen before, and they deserve appreciation. The Blue and White Party failed in this election because it supports the right wing, and the people prefer what's original rather than what is an imitation. Therefore, Netanyahu was elected.
Nimrod Flashenberg, you heard there your party leader saying how you've taken votes from the blue and white this time. I notice you've also taken votes from the traditional left in Israel. The Labour Party, which had been in power so many times, now is reduced to the shadow of its former self. Are you the new opposition?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are the new opposition, and I think we have been for a while now. I think that the Zionist left has been on a downward trajectory for years now because it doesn't really suggest an alternative. Because as we saw with Benny Gantz, who doesn't even, you can't even call him a Zionist leftist, but as we saw with center and center-left parties all through recent years, they mimic the politics of the right wing. They agree to the Trump peace plan. They incite against the Arab representatives in the Knesset. They replicate the agenda of Bibi Netanyahu. And I think that it is really clear that if you try to mimic the right, the people would prefer the original. So we are the only ones who are presenting a wide ideological alternative that speaks about equality for all citizens in Israel and the end to the occupation, because that is a major issue that is not even discussed in the Zionist left that is left.
Okay, so Nimrod, if you're the opposition now, you have between 15 and 16 seats in a chamber that has 120. That's a small opposition.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but it's a beginning. I think that there's a reckoning in the Zionist left and an understanding that we need to build cooperation between Jewish forces and Arab forces, and that are really challenging the norm. It's going to take a while. I mean, Israel is a country that has deep racism and deep violence within it. It is based on a violent occupation of the Palestinian people. It's going to take a long time to present a real alternative, a real ruling alternative. But I think that this strong showing by the Joint List could be the beginning of this wider Jewish-Arab coalition that will challenge the Zionist and right-wing orthodoxy.
Daniel Sturman, Israeli politics for decades was with lots of different parties, but essentially dominated by two of them, Likud on the right, Labor on the left. Is the Joint List the new Labor Party?
That's clearly not the case. We have, sorry, the Joint List is essentially an Arab party, and the assessment that you made earlier, at least according to an analysis made by Harel Kane, who did some very wonderful charts displaying where voters have moved between the various elections in the last year, the And the growth of the joint list is almost entirely due to new voters, to more people coming out to the polls. Now, we discussed earlier that this may be because of a reaction to the Trump peace plan, but it's simply not true that Labor voters are moving to the joint list. Labor voters either stayed home or they moved to the blue and white, or even just a very small amount even moved to the Likud. The joint list is representing a segment of the population that is growing, and the party is growing in size, the list is growing in size because more people are coming out to vote for it that weren't voting at all before, not because they're convincing members of the general Israeli public.
And why is that?
You'll have to ask them. It's a matter of what their campaign focus is on. I don't think it helps very much that they refuse to join coalitions even when invited.
Iris Makler, your thoughts on the strong showing of the joint list and the weak showing of the traditional left-wing and peace parties?
I'd say that part of the strong showing of the joint list is that there were no Arab lawmakers likely to be elected in the other major parties. You know, there's a man whose name is Issawi Frege. He was very central to Meretz, to one of the left-wing parties. He wasn't in their top three. They only got 3 seats, and we're lucky to get 3 this time. So the fact, I mean, he brought a lot of votes to Meretz last time. So the fact that the major parties have pushed any Arab representation out, I think was part of the reason that the joint list expanded, increased its votes so dramatically. I think another reason is definitely the Trump peace plan. There was a suggestion there of moving the Arab citizens of northern Israel to the Palestinian Authority. That's an extreme position that Avigdor Lieberman holds. Not many other people within the Israeli political spectrum hold that position, and it's in the Trump peace plan, and I think that definitely rattled Arab voters. And maybe there's also a time, I've just heard a very interesting Arab analyst explaining that the time has come for Arabs to be part of this parliament, not just people who won't take part in the parliament and will be there 16 votes from the outside, but actually part of the parliament, part of running this country because they are citizens of this country. That's a difference. It's a revolutionary difference in how the Arab citizens of Israel view themselves, and he says it's time for that change. So I think all of those things together contribute to why Arab voters feel more confident and want to be part of this parliament and to have the power in the parliament that they deserve as 20% of the population.
And could it be a one-off once the Trump peace plan comes and goes?
Look, it is possible, but I think if the leaders of this party play it wisely, play it well, take part in politics, bring home benefits to their voters, then it doesn't have to be a one-off at all.
All right, let me ask you, I'm curious to know, Nimrod Flaschenberg, how does it work inside of the party? What's the dynamic between those who are Jewish and those who are Arab?
The joint list is not a party. It's a coalition of 4 different parties. 3 of them represent the Arab minority in Israel, and one is Hadash, which is the current incarnation of the Communist Party. That's the party I'm from, which is a Jewish Arab party. And that is the party of the leader of the joint list, Ayman Odeh, and the strongest of the 4 components in terms of the representatives. So we are a Jewish Arab party that has, activists from both communities that work in the same institutions and so on. And we believe that, and we have been a Jewish Arab party for 100 years. So we have a pretty strong tradition of understanding that the only way forward in this situation, in this country that is defined by racial and national differences, is to join forces in finding common interest of both peoples living here. So, I don't know, our ideology is quite helpful in making us work together.
Because I've heard 2 sorts of arguments. One, which is that this is a way to be more effective for what you've just described you're campaigning for. And the other, well, some Arabs who say, let's just move on. There's not going to be a 2-state solution. Let's just move on and deal with the reality as it is.
You know, a lot of the Israeli media, whenever they speak to Arab MKs, they say, you know, you deal with the Palestinian issue, but your citizens, they're interested in only in sewage and roads. And they are interested in these civilian issues, and the MKs are working on these issues. But I think that the strong showing yesterday I think we don't have the percentages yet, but I think more than 90% of the Arabs who voted for the joint list. So I think that the political program, which balances both civilian issues and the political issue of the conflict together, is something that the Palestinian minority in Israel is really in favor of. So I think that whole shtick about saying they're not doing what their representatives want, it was proven to be a lie in this election.
I don't mean to spoil the party, but I think that the joint list may have peaked because there's a limit to how many seats a non-Zionist party can get in Israel. And I think that the Trump plan has helped them somewhat, but the vast majority of Israelis do support the Trump plan. And I don't think that that's a party that's going to one day get 20 or 25 seats. I think it may have peaked, and you have to remember that there are parties where most of the people who consider themselves left-wing can vote for, and I'm not sure that they will vote for a non-Zionist party. I think that this party that may have peaked during these elections, I'm not sure they will get the same scores in the next elections.
Daniel Sturman, is that what your crystal ball tells you?
I strongly disagree with that. The Arab population is 20% of the country. 20% of 120 seats in the Knesset is 24 seats. It would be very, very easy for the joint list to continue to rise, maybe split again into two separate parties once it's more confident that it can safely that both halves can safely cross the threshold, and it can reach 24 seats just by turning out at the same proportion that everybody else in the country does.
But I don't think that every Arab will necessarily vote for the joint list, because most of the Arabs are integrated in Israeli societies, and they might actually vote for another party. I don't know why you assume that every Arab will necessarily vote for the joint list.
I don't assume that at all, but polling has shown, especially in the last couple of elections. Exactly. Most Arabs do vote for the joint list. Now, if the joint list does in fact grow and does reach its correct proportion, so to speak, of Israeli society, I think that would be a very good thing for Israeli-Arab cooperation with Israeli Jews, because you could have those parties split up again, feel safe and secure in the fact that they are there and they're not going away, and then they can compete with each other for cooperation, for entrance into the coalitions and for getting things that they want, which is how things used to be. It's only in the last couple of decades that the Arab parties have utterly refused to join, even when invited into the Israeli coalitions. I'll give you an example. In 2015, the Yesh Atid party was left without a vote-sharing agreement. Now, a vote-sharing agreement is when two parties sign an agreement to help each other get an extra seat if possible. You had Meretz and Labor, and they signed a vote-sharing agreement together. Yesh Atid was left without a vote-sharing agreement. So Meretz turned to the joint list and said, you know what, we'll break our agreement with Labor, you sign with us, that will free Labor to sign with Yesh Atid, and we'll all benefit. And most of the joint list agreed to this, but the Balad party vetoed the idea. And the idea ended. So the question is, will the joint list be beholden to the more reactionary members, to the more not isolationist in the sense of World Cup politics, but isolationist in the sense of Knesset politics, to the isolationist members of that party, or will they grow large enough that they can say to them, you know what, you go on your own. We will work in cooperation with the Israeli government. We will work in cooperation with the Israeli Jews, and we will make things better for everybody.
All right, let me ask Nimrod Flaschenberg that, because in this instance, it was Benny Gantz who said he didn't want to join in a coalition with you. But if he had reached out his hand, would you have taken it?
I think we would not enter a coalition right now because we do have a deep conflict with the basic fact of the Israeli occupation and some of and I think we will not be a part of a government until the occupation ends. But in the 1990s, when the Oslo Accords were reached, the Hadash party, one of the components of the joint list, and another Arab party that existed in the 90s, they supported from the outside Rabin's government in order to implement the Oslo Accords. So there is a precedent of us giving our political force in order to maintain a government that strives for peace and for better conditions for the Palestinian minority. And that is something we are prepared to do. And if we have 20 seats or 16 seats, but that requires a Zionist left that is willing to go toward peace, that is not accepting the deal of the century, which is actually the deal of destroying the two-state solution and the annexation of the settlements in the West Bank.
Part of the
reason need a different partner on the Jewish side.
But part of the reasons why the joint list does not represent the actual percentage of Arabs in Israel is because many Arabs are not necessarily concerned about Palestinian nationalism, but are happy with the fact that the economy, the Israeli economy, is doing well, that the Netanyahu government has spent a lot of money improving the infrastructure in Arab towns, and some of them may have actually voted for the Zionist parties.
Let me turn to Iris Makler on this. Iris,
maybe 2%.
Let me ask you, Iris, on this. What's your view? Is again, are we at a sort of are we witnessing a metamorphosis of the political landscape in Israel, or is this just a storm in a teacup?
I go back to what I said. If there were Arab members of parliament or people on the list with a realistic place in any of the major parties, then perhaps the joint list wouldn't have done so well. It is a question of how the major parties integrate Arab politicians. There was one Arab politician who was a minister, and it was because he really insisted, a Likud minister. And Isawi Frege isn't on the merits list, even though he was hugely instrumental in many things leading up to this parliament, actually, including the deal between Meretz and the Labour Party. So I think because it's this act of keeping the politicians out of the main game that strengthens them in the joint list. If they weren't in the joint list, if they were in the main parliament, in the main parties, in greater representation, then maybe they wouldn't have to be in the joint list.
All right,
I think we're seeing a moment. I think we are seeing a moment, but I don't know where it's going to go.
All right, let's talk about what we do know, which is by next Monday, we'll have the official results, Iris. Talk us through the calendar. And again, that calendar is coming up against that of the start of Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial.
That's right. By the 10th of March, we have the numbers, which at the moment look pretty even for the two major blocks, with Avigdor Lieberman, the kingmaker. On the 17th of March is the date both that the president will call on one of the leaders of one of the parties to try to form a government, and it's the date that Benjamin Netanyahu's trial begins. And I know that's only a formal beginning, but it is a significant double bill, if you like, because it could have legal ramifications. It's not clear that someone who's been charged can actually be in the position of being offered this role. If you are the Prime Minister already, you can continue to be the Prime Minister. It's an open legal question. And I do know that there is a plan also for a legal challenge.
There will certainly be a legal challenge if the president were to offer the task of forming a government to Netanyahu. There will certainly be a legal challenge to that, and if the Supreme Court will probably decide that he can, but which would be the proper application of the law. But if they decide not to, then it's all over.
All right, and whether or not you like or dislike Israel's longest ever serving prime minister, what is certain is that he's still the one hogging the limelight 35 years after Netanyahu burst onto the scene as Israel's ambassador to the UN, nearly a quarter century after his first stint as prime minister. He still rules, he still divides.
I was a Likud supporter since the era of Menachem Begin and the real Likud. I'm against what's happening nowadays when there is an autocracy, as Netanyahu drove away all the senior Likud members surrounding him just to be an autocrat in the Likud. This is no longer the Likud. This is not the Likud. This is a Bibi party.
I think these indictments mean nothing. It's just a plot against Netanyahu, and it will end up the same as it did for Trump. Trump was acquitted, and Netanyahu will be acquitted too.
Bibi is like a Mercedes. Once you get used to riding in a Mercedes, it's difficult to downgrade to a Subaru.
So here's Makler. There you hear it. He's a Mercedes, not a Subaru. And you were mentioning in part one how much energy he seemed to have on the campaign trail.
Yeah, no, he is a Mercedes, I think, and he's very popular with his base, certainly, and across Israeli politics. I mean, he does divide. When I say he's very popular, people appreciate his skills on the world stage. I've heard a number of people say to me, he is a statesman. He has a special relationship with Vladimir Putin, with, of course, Donald Trump, a bromance with Donald Trump, and all those things are significant. We won't find another leader like him. They appreciate the good economic situation that Israel is in, and they link those two things back to his leadership. On the other hand, there are people who can't abide him. They feel, that they would like to get used to a Subaru again. They don't want this Mercedes because it is autocratic. It has changed the Likud, and I know Likud members who won't vote Likud now because Benjamin Netanyahu has changed their party into something else. So I've had Israelis say to me, we don't want a royal family. We're not that kind of place. This is a democracy. It's not a kingdom. So he definitely is divisive, but there's life in him yet. 70 years old, more energy than other people on the campaign trail, more energy than his opponents on the campaign trail, I felt, in this election. Some say it's because it's a personal energy. He's definitely looking at his own political survival, and that gets him G'd up, but he's always been like this.
It's very difficult to speak about autocracy when the supposed autocrat has had to go through 3 elections in 1 year, democratic elections. So it's very difficult to speak about autocracy.
Daniel Sturman, what surprised you the most in this election campaign and its results?
What surprised me the most, I'm not going to say that anything really surprised me. The results were fairly in line with the previous election and the one before it. The only major difference is the continued rise of the joint list, which is mostly because of increased Arab unity and affinity for each other.
But when it comes to Netanyahu himself, because seen from the outside, we're all wondering about it.
It's really just basically the same thing. He does the same thing every election, and sometimes he gets a little bit more, sometimes he gets a little bit less. The people forget the difference between 35 and 32 seats is actually very, very small. It's 2.5% of the vote. So there's not really much of a difference in how he conducted this campaign and how he conducted the previous two.
Ron Sofer, so I know they tried it and they were unable to do it. At some point, should they raise the threshold for entering parliament so that it isn't always this wafer-thin majority and these tight coalitions?
Well, sometimes they say that if you lower the threshold and have, then more parties could have passed and helped Netanyahu get to 60.
Because you've had 3 elections in a row. Is the problem the candidates or is the problem the system?
The problem is that you have basically an opposition party in Gantz's party that basically have a very similar platform as the Likud, because they realize that most of the Israeli population is right wing, and the only difference between them is that they're anti-Netanyahu. Because if you look at Gantz's platform, he doesn't say that he will not accept Trump's plan. It's basically very similar to the Likud's, and the only thing that differentiates them is Netanyahu.
All right, Netanyahu, who will continue to be in the spotlight in the weeks to come, especially March 17th. Ron Sofer, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Nimrod Flashenberg for being with us from Tel Aviv, and from Jerusalem, Daniel Sturman and Iris Makler. thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.